I'm delighted to be here to be starting the new term of PEFM, so welcome to PEFM for our term here and for our first meeting. I think it's the first meeting also in St Anthony's for the start of the term. Delighted to have my friend and colleague Bill Keegan here to talk to us. Bill, as you probably know, is a very long-time journalist, started off in the FT, worked also at the Daily Mail, and longest of all was, I think, 20 years economics editor of The Observer, and now is senior economic correspondent of The Observer. Partly most significantly, from my point of view, he had a one-year secondment to the Bank of England in the time when I started the Bank of England.
76-7. Yes.
76 to 7, which was also a traumatic year when Britain went and borrowed from the IMF, the last time so far. And and so anyway, Bill is here to talk about his book, which I have read, which I really encourage everyone to. It's 9 Crises. It puts everything in perspective. Brexit is not new in the sense that we've had crises for the last 50 years. It may, as Bill says, be one of the biggest or the most self-inflicted, but we've had 9 crises. And so anyway, I leave it to Bill to talk you through all this. Yeah, over to you. And I think Bill, for his time, I mean, people who've read his point, one of the most commendable parts of Bill's journalism is really, I think, talking truth to power through the decades of all the different parts as successive politicians have done economic nonsense, and many journalists have gone along with the nonsense. I think some of us still remember Sir Douglas Corridor and the stories of that from then about the civil service. And I think it's fairly unusual in journalists in not bending significantly with the economic currents of the time. So there is definitely a consistency through. Yeah, politicians come and go. Quality economic journalists stay with us. So over to you, Bill.
Thank you, Charles. That's a very generous introduction. Thank you. Before I go any further, I must make the point that when I worked for the Daily Mail, it was then called the Daily Mail and News Chronicle in the 1960s. It was not what it became. This is very important. Because the News Chronicle was an old liberal newspaper that my father used to get. And for a time they had some rather good editors, and then everything went wrong. So just clear that up straight away. One of the great things about working at the bank, of course, is meeting Charles. I'll talk about the book. I'll just give you a sort of few minutes of how I got into this business. I went to a Jesuit grammar school and was in the classical 6, and I got into Trinity Cambridge on classics, but I was one of the last of the national servicemen, and I then spent a year teaching. And when I turned up at Trinity, Alan Carr, the classics don, said, Keegan, I see you finished your national service in 1959. Why did it take you a year to come up here? I said, well, you offered me a place in 1960. And in those days, you know, society was so deferential, you didn't dare question. He said, you should have run this up. Anyway, I got there, and then I had to tell him that I'd changed my mind about reading classics. And I was so interested in politics that I felt that you couldn't really understand the political debate without some economics. And I thought of reading history, and I thought of reading English. But I thought, if I read I mustn't offend anybody here who's an English don. I've got a son reading English at Leeds, but I decided I didn't want to study English. I just wanted to read it for the rest of my life. And the same with history, so I read economics. And so it was economics that led me to the Financial Times in 1963. And in those days, the jobs market was pretty easy. You know, the unemployment was very low, although there were lots of controversies about why shouldn't it be lower. Indeed, during my lectures at Cambridge, Professor Richard Kahn, great collaborator of Keynes's and very close to Keynes, used to fulminate about Thornycroft and Selwyn Lloyd for running the economy with, aiming at unemployment of 2 to 2.5%. He thought it should be 1.5. Those are the days. But anyway, it was very easy. I wrote to the Financial Times and I got a job there. And I was on the general feature writing desk. But I had a holiday job at the Daily Mail, and they invited me back, more than double my salary. And in those days, went from £900 to £2,000 a year, which was considered a lot of money, and it was. And so I was there for the Daily Mail News Chronicle for 3 years. And then the Financial Times invited me back because the Times had decided to take on the FT, and it started a new business section. And they did, it was quite, this was old style politics in Fleet Street. They were trying to defeat the FT. But the trouble with the early editions of the Times business section, the Daily Times, they kept making mistakes, and they then decided they had to just cool it a bit. And anyway, the Financial Times survived. And I was a feature writer, but Samuel Britton, who was the chief economics commentator for many years, invited me to do the news. So I became the economics correspondent. And so from 1967 to 1976, I was the economics correspondent writing about Crises daily. First crisis, of course, was devaluation, the pound in your pocket episode, which that led to Callaghan's resignation as Chancellor. And it was the result of a balance of payments crisis, which, funny enough, the deficit was far lower than it is these days. But in those days, everybody focused on the balance of payments. And one of the themes I find over the years is the way that focal points change, fashion changes in economics, what people are obsessed by. It becomes the public sector borrowing requirement. One of the aims over the years was the defeat of inflation. Indeed, there was a whole school of mainly right-wing economists who said once we've defeated inflation, everything will be fine. Well, there isn't much inflation around, but I don't know about you, but I don't think everything is fine. So the first Chancellor, I knew Maudling a bit because the Labour had inherited Maudling's Dash for Growth, which ended in disaster, and the crucial decision was not to devalue straight on in '64, because Harold Wilson had a thing about devaluation. And when they did devalue, it was they had to. And then Roy Jenkins came in as Chancellor, and his job was to make devaluation work, cut down on spending, imports, courage exports. And we discovered something called the J-curve, where things get worse before they get better. And the immediate effect was to raise the cost of imports and make the balance payments worse. And in the end, it worked, and it looked as though in 1970 that the policy was successful. And then, shortly before the election, two jumbo jets were imported, and all the papers started saying Britain back in the red. And this had a major influence on the election. And of course Labour lost. And I'm sure a lot of you will remember that Harold Wilson thought he would win the election of 1970 and lose the election of 1974. And the reverse happened. Now I think that one of the strategic mistakes made by Labour was not to implement in place of strife in 1969. There was a white paper about it, and Barbara Castle, a left-wing politician, was there, wanted to do this. Callaghan was legislating against the unions. And that set the theme for the 70s. In came Ted Heath with a desire to control the unions and have a more market-orientated policy, branded by Harold Wilson Selsdon Man, which was named after a hotel in Selsdon in Croydon, where they had a strategy meeting. And they were not going to prop up lame ducks. And then we came to the winter of '72, and unemployment rose to 1 million, which was unheard of in those days, post-war. Rolls-Royce was in trouble around the same time. There were riots in Glasgow. The chief constable of Glasgow rang number 10 and said that unless there's a change of policy, I can't be responsible for public order in Glasgow. And that led to the phrase that got into the English language after, the U-turn. And the brakes were off, and we had what was, after the Maudling boom, we had the Barber boom. The Barber boom was really Ted Heath's boom, because Ted Heath was a very strong, forceful character. Tony Barber was a taxation expert, but not really a strong chancellor. And the policy looked pretty dangerous then. Where it really collapsed, when they were trying to control the unions and inflation, was one of what Harold Macmillan used to call events. It was the oil crisis of '73, because OPEC, in reaction to American attitude to the Arab-Israeli war and all that, OPEC doubled the price of oil. The Saudis started it, and everybody else joined in, doubled it again, and the price of oil, which had been assumed to be dirt cheap, and was for many years, became a major factor, contributed to a rise in inflation, and really that was the end of Ted Heath's attempt to control the economy. What we ended up with a 3-day week, which and the election which was based on who runs the economy, the miners or Ted Heath, and it turned out to be the miners. But but in fact, and I go into it in this book, there was a very unfortunate episode because, as I say, Tony Barber was rather a weak chancellor, but he showed his kind of toughness at just the wrong time. There was a meeting of NEDI, National Economic Development Council, in January '74. The miners, because market forces were operating, so because the price of oil had gone up, the price of coal had gone up, they were in a strong position. They were arguing for a huge increase in wages. And the TUC came up with an offer that they would not make this. They'd make this exceptional. There wouldn't be a huge queue of people wanting rises elsewhere. This was put to Barber by the unions at a crucial meeting. My old friend Sir Douglas Allen, subsequently Lord Crome, was was sitting just behind Barber, and he was a very tough nut, Douglas Allen. He tried to send a note to Barber saying, you've got to accept this offer because this is serious. Barber turned it down without getting the note, accidents of history, and the rest was history because it all ended in chaos. We then, the next crisis, of course, was the 3-day week was there's one anecdote about the 3-day week which I think you'll love. Patrick Jenkin, who was a minister in the cabinet, said that the situation is so serious that television will go off at 10:30 and people should brush their teeth in the dark. So the Daily Express sent somebody up to the Holly Lodge estate in Highgate and photographs of all lights blazing in his house. So that kind of sort of put the kibosh on that attitude. In came Labour, and they inherited a disastrous situation because not only had the oil crisis led to a precipitate rise in inflation, but in a noble attempt to somehow come to an agreement with the unions, the Heath government had introduced something called threshold agreements of wages, that wages would be indexed to the cost of living. But the trouble was the cost of living was going up month by month because of the oil price increase. And we had inflation in 1975 rising to 25%, if some of you remember. And then there was the 1976 crisis and the recourse to the IMF. As I say, the inflation was bad, but the balance of payment situation was not as bad as it is now, but we'll get onto that later. Am I going on too long in this history?
That's just good.
Okay. Yeah. We went to the IMF. Now, that was when I met Charles, because I was working in the Bank of England. But I had been doing stories at the FT about the state of the financial markets, given the inflation and worries about the balance of payments. What I didn't realise till I got to the bank just what a drain on the reserves there were. These things were. There was a lot of imaginative accounting in the published figures, but for a time, the pound held up because traditionally the oil producers had deposited their money in London. But then they started diversifying to New York, Zurich, etc. And that contributed to a disastrous run of the pound. And in the end, we had to go to the IMF to rescue the situation. Now, Dennis Healey, who was Chancellor, and a man I greatly admired, had a rough time, but he managed to see it through. He and Callaghan, so between them, kept the cabinet together during a very difficult time, with people like Wedgwood Ben, Tony Benn, Lord Stansgate, call him what you like, wanting an alternative strategy. And they stuck together and they came to an agreement with the fund. and the inflation started going down, balance of payments began to improve. But then we come to the winter of discontent in 79, and that was really the final straw. And poor old Callaghan has spent, in his memoirs, he devotes 10 or 12 pages to a meeting in Guadeloupe called by Gerald Ford to discuss nuclear strategy. And he came back to London Airport, and the headline was "Crisis, what crisis?" He'd said he'd been away, and there were all these that people weren't burying the dead and so on, and that was really the end of Labour's economic reputation yet again. Although they fell not on the actual crucial vote was on Scottish devolution, which brought the government down in '79. I'd like to tell you one story which relates to this and the subsequent years, because when I was at the bank, not only did I have the great pleasure of meeting Charles, but I met a chap who became a great friend, but whose career ran into a spot of bother, called Rupert Pennant-Ray. Rupert Pennant-Ray suggested we write a book together, and we did. And I had a chapter in this book on the '76 crisis, and I went to Washington to interview all the people, a lot of the people involved, including somebody called Bob Hormats, who was in the National Security Council, and he told me the crucial story, which explains something that has long been quoted against Callaghan, because they say that Callaghan began monetarism, but Callaghan said, he did actually say in his speech to the Labour Party conference, you can no longer spend your way out of a crisis, those days are gone. That was entirely tactical to make sure they got the loan. And the people involved in this were the White House, Brent Scowcroft and Hormats, who were dealing with this extraordinary right-wing US Treasury, somebody called Bill Simon and somebody called Ed Yeo, who were worried that somehow or other the United Kingdom would, we don't want to prop up a socialist government. What the White House people won in their discussion was that if you let these people down, you really will get a social government. You really will get wedge of Ben and so on. Right, but that led. I won't say inevitably, but it did lead to Thatcherism and the rise of monetarism, and Professor Friedman's simple solutions. And so in '79, inflation was down to 10%, and a year later, the government that was going to bring inflation down to 5%, it was up to 20%. That was partly a result of some rash decisions made by Mrs. Thatcher with public sector awards during the campaign, and it was partly to do with the budget, because that budget of '79 stood out as one where taxation, there's no doubt that it was absurd that the top rate of tax for investment income was 98%, which not many people paid, and the top rate of income tax was 83%. Anyway, they were determined to make a splash on the first budget, and they revised that if you bring the top rate down, you're going to have to do something, the investment rate, 83, you've got to do something about the 98, do something about the 83. So that was brought down to 60%. And the Treasury said, well, you're going to do this, slight problem with the public sector borrowing requirements, you're going to have to raise indirect taxes. And VAT went up from 8 to 15%. We had quite a funny moment at the Observer when we were chasing this story, and I rang a certain Treasury official at home, and we'd heard that they were going to raise VAT. And I said to this chap, I hear the VAT rate's going up from 8 to 12%. And this chap said with wonderful, it wasn't actually Sir Douglas Ross, it wasn't actually Douglas Ross, but it was somebody else, said, why stop there? And that gave us the clue, and we knew that they'd said they wouldn't double it, so we actually stuck our necks at that VAT going up to 15%. Anyway, so then a series of disasters led to inflation going up to 20% again, and that led to what I call in the crisis of pseudo-monetarism, when a lot of British industry went to the wall. The chairman of ICI went to number 10 and said, Prime Minister, do you seriously want us to remain in Britain because things are so tough? the exchange rate had leapt up, and the justification, the alleged justification, was because of the possession of the North Sea. In fact, there are lots of countries with oil whose exchange rates were not shooting up like that. And Mrs. Thatcher's personal economic advisor, Alan Walters, spent a lot of time moving between Washington and London, and he noticed what was happening with the exchange rate. He said, this is ridiculous. And he commissioned a study, and the most they could attribute to the exchange rate in the rise in the pound to, I think that Ottmar Emminger, the Bundesbank's president at the time, said the biggest overvaluation of any major currency in history. Which was 20%. It was just the monetarist doctrine meant they kept raising interest rates, trying to control the money supply. Money was pouring, money was driving up the pound. The recession eventually brought inflation down to 3.5% by 1983, the next election, and when Nigel Lawson came in. But unemployment went on rising until 86. There is what I regard as a myth that the 1981 budget, which actually raised taxes, showed that the Keynesian economists who complained were wrong. But at the time, the Keynesian economists didn't know that partly as a result of what Walters was advising, and partly the Treasury, the monetary policy was changed and become much more relaxed. So the idea was to get the pound down. So that changed the dynamics of the economy. And it meant that those economists, they just didn't know that. But nevertheless, unemployment went on rising to over 3 million in 86. Now Lawson, whom I've known for many years, had adopted monetarism. It didn't work, so tried something else. He tried. He was an expansionist. The 1987 election was quite easy for them. The 83 election, of course, was they'd won the Falklands War, and Michael Foot produced the longest suicide note in history as a manifesto, so that wasn't difficult for the government to win that. But Lawson became very cocky with his policies, and the next crisis was the Lawson boom and the reaction. Now, Lawson, on the whole, most people think, he fell out with Thatcher, she didn't want the ERM, and his chancellorship was all a disaster. But from the point of view of his beliefs and sort of conservative beliefs, one policy change in which he had a huge effect was in cutting the top rate tax you had to get from 60% to 40%. And apart from a temporary effort during after the financial crisis under Labour, the top rate of tax has stayed there, and it stayed low. And I think I'll come on to this later. Is one of the reasons why we have so many problems now. That we don't do in this country what I think we need to do, which is finance a lot of public spending by owning up to the fact you've got to finance it, as the Scandinavians do. But so Lawson actually had a major impact on history with that, but is basically known for the boom getting out of hand and his falling out with Thatcher. There's another nice thing. I've repeated interviews with every chancellor from Dennis Healey to Ken Clarke at the back of this book, the interviews were conducted in 2007, and they still, I think, read quite interestingly. And there's one moment when, Geoffrey Howe made his famous dramatic speech resigning. People never thought he had it in him, and people thought it must be his wife. But I think it was him. And on reasonable authority, he'd had enough. But some years later, he was at I think Stratford somewhere, and a chap came up because he'd used the story about going to bat for her was like he was sending your opening batsman in without a bat or this one, and this chap came up to him and said, "Aren't you the chap who beat Mrs. Thatcher up with a cricket bat?" Got it slightly wrong. Then the Black Wednesday, the next crisis I cover, and you can gather we're leading up to this with the ERM. Now, I actually have always had some sympathy. I was brought up in the Bretton Woods era. I've some sympathy with attempts to control wild gyrations in exchange rate, and of course the Bretton Woods system broke down in the 70s. And at one stage there was an attempt at getting something called target zones, where you just try to keep the major currencies within a reasonable, sensible ranges for competitiveness. I once wrote an article about this, and I gathered that Paul Volcker, who was a very distinguished Federal Reserve chairman, also believed in target zones. So I sent him a copy of this, and to my delight and amazement, I got a handwritten letter back from him saying, "Dear Keegan, thank you very much for sending your letter." He said, "The trouble is, I think you and I are the only people in the world who believe in target zones." But anyway, the ERM was an attempt at controlling the exchange rate because monetarism had failed and Lawson was looking for a new lodestar, but in the end it was done by Major, and it was trying to control inflation by joining the exchange rate mechanism, which was largely dominated by Germany, and of course German inflation, after all the lessons of the 20s and 30s, was kept very low. Unfortunately, this was another accident of history, the wrong time, just as the threshold agreements, the indexation of wages was done at the wrong time. This coincided with the very welcome unification of Germany, which the problem was that became very inflationary, the cost of bringing East Germany in. So the German inflation rate, for the first time in decades, started going up again, and therefore monetary policy within the ERM was geared to that, and our recession, the post-Lawson recession, went on for too long, and that ended in tears. And I remember, Major has a wonderful note in his memoirs, where he says, when we went into he says, these days everybody says we went into the ERM at the wrong time for the wrong reasons, the wrong rate. He said, at the time they all wanted us to go in, but they've sort of changed their mind. So we came out, and that was an economic disaster for the Conservatives. But it happened after the election of '92. Now, I thought that a lot of people thought that the Tories might lose the '92 election, but they won it. But let me give an example of the way these things change. I happened to be I'm a racing man, I happened to be at Ascot the day before the '92 election. I was in the company of my friend Roger Bootle, with whom I have some differences these days on Brexit, but we'll come on to that. And the bookmakers were offering 6-1 against the Tories winning in a 2-horse race. 6-1 again. And we just assumed that they were going to win. So we've been kicking ourselves ever since. We didn't put a penny on that. We could have made our fortune. Anyway, but Black Wednesday happened after that election, and it was a difficult time for Major and co. And I actually think that Black Wednesday was one of the main reasons, the things that led to the move to Brexit, because it stiffened the arms of all these the conservative Eurosceptics, always known by Ted Heath as skeptics, and got to the 1970s. Got to the election of '97. Which Ken Clarke said that a party led by a chimpanzee could have won, could have beaten the Tories. Anyway, Labour came in, and I've gone on a bit, so I better just. And with the Independent Bank of England, which was considered, many people criticise Gordon Brown, I think often wrongly, but the independence of the Bank of England was one of the big innovations. Financial supervision was separated from the conduct of the economy. Now, the financial crisis occurred because the whole financial establishment was obsessed with inflation targets and deregulation, and the feeling that all was what was Mervyn King's favourite thing about non-inflationary sustained expansion. And we know what they did in tears in 2007 and 8. Now, I think that certainly the regulation that was conducted well, but it wasn't just here, it was also in the States. And I think that Gordon Brown is much maligned because although public spending increased, they intended to, it wasn't public spending that caused the financial crisis. Gordon Brown did not cause a financial crisis in the United States, France, Germany, and although he slightly exaggerated things when he said in the Commons that he'd saved the world, he was terribly important in the background in 2008 and 9 to the policies to relax monetary policy and have a fiscal boost. And my next crisis is the austerity, where my main criticism of this is that, to quote Lord Robbins, a great distinguished economist from years ago, that the time to cut back is in the boom. The time to expand is when things are bad. And we were only just recovering from that terrible recession when in came the Cameron-Osborne government of 2010, and they introduced this policy of austerity, which included, among other things, cuts of up to 40% in local authority grants, and you see the consequences all around you. Right, that brings us to the last crisis covered here, which is Brexit. Now, I think if this goes ahead, it's the biggest crisis I've ever witnessed or covered in my entire career. But I'm still hoping that it can be stopped. I just don't see any mileage in soft, do you feel like soft chocolate or a hard chocolate? Soft breakfast. It's important to us and Europe that we stay within the customs union, but also within the single market. Ken Clarke says in his memoirs that the single market was Mrs. Thatcher's greatest achievement. I repeat that. Ken Clarke says in his memoirs the single market was Mrs. Thatcher's greatest achievement. I knew Lord Cofield very well. He was the one who did all the negotiation. And I find it difficult to believe that the so-called inheritors of Thatcher are trying to destroy all this. I find it just appalling. And I'll just finish by saying that part of this crisis is the leader of the Labour Party and his entourage, who seem to me to be sort of old-fashioned international socialists who somehow think that the European Union is a capitalist conspiracy, who want to leave because they can then, God knows what will happen to the pound if they're allowed to conduct some socialism in one country experiment. But I'm hoping that will never happen. And there's a lot at stake here, and perhaps I should stop there.